The mountain at the edge of Rivergate never cast a shadow, even when the sun sat low and orange behind it. The colonists had noticed this in their very first week on the planet, and nobody, human or alien, could explain why. It simply stood there, gray and silent, wrapped in mist that never seemed to lift past its middle ridge. The workers who came from other worlds to help build the human settlement always looked away when they spoke about it, and none of them ever walked past the old stone markers that circled its base. Rivergate was still young. Only 3 years had passed since the first ships landed and the first buildings rose from the red soil. Daniel worked long hours fixing the water systems that kept the colony alive, and most evenings he came home with grease on his hands and dust in his hair. His wife Kate spent her days in the fields beyond the settlement, studying strange plants that grew nowhere else in the galaxy, plants that bent toward the mountain instead of the sun. And in the middle of it all was their daughter Nora, barely 2 years old, who spent her days toddling between the porch and the garden, chasing insects that glowed faint blue in the afternoon light. Nora did not know that her family lived on one of the few worlds in the galaxy that alien governments called restricted. She did not know that the mountain she sometimes pointed at from her father's shoulders was home to something ancient, something that had outlived a dozen alien empires and watched countless ships rise and fall from orbit. All she knew was that the mountain was tall and gray, and that sometimes it made a low sound in the night that felt more like a heartbeat than wind. The older workers, hired from nearby alien systems to help set up the colony's early buildings, told stories about the mountain whenever the humans were not around to hear. They spoke of a creature that had slept there since before their own people learned to build starships, a creature so old that its name had changed 100 times across 100 different tongues. Some called it a god, others called it a curse. All of them agreed on one thing: nothing that walked close to that mountain ever walked back down. Grant, the administrator of Rivergate, had heard these stories more times than he could count. He did not believe all of it, but he respected the fear behind it. He had drawn the colony's boundary lines with great care, keeping every building, every field, every road at a wide and careful distance from the base of the mountain. It was not just caution, it was survival. The regional council that watched over this part of space had made it clear, in cold and formal language, that humanity's presence on this world was being watched closely, and any mistake near that mountain would be used as proof that humans were too reckless to be trusted with a world like this one. That was the real reason for the visit that arrived on a gray morning, 3 weeks after Nora's second birthday. A sleek silver shuttle came down through the clouds, its engines humming a note too smooth and even to be anything human-made. Word spread through Rivergate fast. An Ithri delegation had come, sent by the regional council to inspect the colony and decide whether humans deserved to keep their small foothold on this world. The Ithri were an old species, older than most governments in this part of the galaxy, and they carried themselves with the quiet certainty of people who had never once needed to prove anything to anyone. Their ambassador, a tall and narrow figure named Voss, stepped off the shuttle first, his pale gray robes catching the wind as he looked over the colony with an expression that was polite on the surface and unimpressed underneath. He had visited 100 new colonies before this one, and in his long life he had rarely seen a species move as fast and as carelessly as humans did. Grant met him at the edge of the landing field, offering a handshake that Voss looked at for a moment before accepting it stiffly. Behind Voss came 3 more members of his delegation, each carrying small devices that scanned the ground, the buildings, and the sky as they walked. "You have grown quickly," Voss said, his voice smooth and formal. "Perhaps too quickly for a world such as this one." Grant kept his face calm. "We follow every guideline your council gave us." Voss glanced toward the mountain, its peak lost in the low gray mist. Guidelines are easy to follow when nothing has yet gone wrong. He did not explain what he meant. He did not need to. Every alien who had ever lived near that mountain understood exactly what could happen if something did. As the delegation walked deeper into the colony, their scanners recording every corner of Rivergate, none of them noticed the small figure slipping quietly out through the garden gate behind Daniel's house. Nora had seen a bright blue insect land on the fence post, and she toddled after it with the single-minded joy that only a 2-year-old could feel, her small boots pressing soft prints into the red dirt. Behind her, the colony buzzed with nervous energy. Inside, Kate was preparing a report on the strange plants for the visiting council, hoping it might soften their view of the settlement. Daniel was called away to fix a sudden fault in the eastern water line, a fault that had never once appeared before that morning. Grant walked Voss through the main square, answering question after question, doing his best to appear calm, while every instinct in him wanted to keep glancing toward his daughter's house. Nobody saw Nora reach the low wooden fence at the back of the garden. Nobody saw her push through the gap, where a board had come loose the week before. And nobody saw her step out onto the open field beyond, her eyes fixed on the little blue insect drifting slowly, steadily, toward the gray shape of the mountain rising in the distance, patient and silent, as it had been for longer than any living creature could remember. The scanner in Voss's hand beeped twice before he had even reached the second row of houses, and each beep made his three assistants glance at each other with quiet unease. The readings did not match anything in their records. The soil held strange minerals. The air carried a faint charge that their instruments struggled to name. Voss said nothing about it, but he noted every strange number in the small journal he kept tucked inside his sleeve, the kind of journal that would later be used to argue that this world was too unstable for a young species to settle. Grant walked beside him, answering questions about power systems, food supply, and waste management, all while trying to steer the group away from the eastern side of the colony, where Daniel was still fighting the strange fault in the water line. It was not going well. Pipes that had worked without trouble for 2 years were suddenly leaking pressure in 3 different places, and no one could explain why it was happening now. On the one day the whole colony needed to look perfect. Kate stood near the edge of her field, holding her notes about the bending plants, waiting for the moment the delegation might walk close enough for her to explain her research. She kept glancing back toward the house, a small habit she had never quite lost since Nora learned to walk. Something about the quiet in the yard bothered her, though she could not say why. The first sign of real trouble came from the sky. Clouds that had been thin and gray all morning began to thicken with startling speed, rolling in low over the mountain and darkening the light across the whole valley. The wind picked up, sharp and sudden, rattling the loose panels on unfinished buildings. Alarms built into the colony's weather system chirped a soft warning, then a louder one, as the readings spiked past anything the settlers had seen since landing. Storm surge, Grant said, more to himself than to Voss. That's new. Voss's expression did not change, but his eyes moved toward the mountain, where the clouds seemed to be gathering thickest, spinning slowly around the peak like water circling a drain. Perhaps not new to this world, he said quietly. Only new to you. Within minutes, the calm morning had turned into chaos. Wind tore at the canvas covers over the storage yards. A support beam on one of the half-built structures groaned and cracked, sending workers running for cover. The colony's warning system called for a full evacuation of the outer buildings, directing everyone toward the central shelter near the square. People moved fast, calling out names, grabbing children, pulling doors shut behind them. Daniel, still elbow-deep in the broken water line, heard the alarm and swore under his breath. He sealed the pipe as best he could and ran for the house, his mind already racing through the short list of things that mattered most. Kate, Nora, and getting them both to shelter before the wind grew any worse. Kate reached the house only seconds after him, her hair whipped loose from its tie, rain beginning to needle down out of the darkened sky. They called Nora's name together, first from the porch, then from the yard, their voices rising with each unanswered second. The garden gate stood open. The loose board in the fence had been pushed wide. Panic hit Kate like a physical blow. She ran to the fence, staring out at the open field beyond, empty except for the wind bending the tall grass in long silver waves. Daniel was already moving, shouting into his radio for anyone nearby to help search, his voice cracking on his daughter's name. Word reached Grant within minutes, cutting through his conversation with Voss like a blade. A child was missing, a human child, and the wind was pushing hard toward the one place in the whole valley where no search party had ever willingly gone. Voss went very still when he heard it. For the first time since stepping off his shuttle, something other than polite disinterest crossed his face. "Which direction?" he asked, his voice suddenly sharp. Grant did not need to answer. Everyone standing in the square had already turned to look at the same gray shape rising through the storm, its peak wrapped in churning cloud, its long shadowless slopes disappearing into mist far below where any human footprint should ever be found. Search teams formed fast, human and alien workers moving together for the first time since the delegation had arrived, all pretense of formality gone. Grant organized groups to sweep the fields in widening circles. Voss, to the surprise of his own assistants, ordered his shuttle's sensors turned toward the mountain, scanning for any trace of body heat against the cold stone. Daniel ran ahead of every search group, ignoring the wind that pushed against him and the rain that stung his eyes, following the last line of small footprints.
I'm coming for you! Just hold on!
The storm washed them away. The prince led straight across the open field, past the last marker post the colony had ever placed, and up toward the base of the slope where the mist began. He stopped there, chest heaving, staring up into the gray nothing where the prince disappeared. Behind him, he could hear Kate's voice, raw and breaking, and the low, urgent tones of Grant directing the search. And somewhere further back, Voss speaking fast and quiet into a communicator, alerting his superiors that a human child had wandered, alone, into the one place in this entire region of space that had never once forgiven a trespasser. Above them all, the storm swirled tighter around the peak, and somewhere deep inside that mist, unseen and unheard by anyone below, something ancient had already noticed the small, warm heartbeat moving steadily up its mountain. Rain did not seem to touch Nora the way it touched everything else. She walked through the storm with the calm curiosity of a child who did not yet understand that the world could be dangerous. Her small boots finding footing on stones slick with water, her eyes fixed on the little blue insect that drifted just ahead of her, always a few steps out of reach, leading her higher and higher up the slope without her ever noticing the climb. The mist thickened around her the further she went, turning the gray light soft and strange, swallowing the sound of the storm until only a low hum remained, a hum that seemed to rise from the ground itself rather than fall from the sky. Nora stopped chasing the insect when it finally vanished into the fog, and for a moment she simply stood there, small and alone on a wide stone ledge, blinking up at shapes she could not yet understand. The ledge was not empty. What looked, at first, like part of the mountain itself began to shift. A ridge of pale gray stone that had seemed fixed and ancient rose slightly, and a low breath moved through the mist, warm and heavy, smelling faintly of iron and old rain. Scales the size of doors caught what little light filtered down from above, each one etched with lines like old writing worn smooth by time. A shape uncoiled slowly from where it had rested, unseen, for longer than any living being on this world could measure, and eyes older than every alien empire that had ever crossed this region of space opened, slow and heavy, to look down at the small human standing at the edge of its territory. Threxus had not moved in longer than most of the visiting species could count. Generations of aliens had built their fear of this mountain around stories of a creature that answered every trespass with fire and ruin, a guardian so absolute that no government had dared test it in living memory. Threxus itself barely remembered the last time it had needed to move at all. Time meant little to something that had outlived stars. But something about the shape in front of it now was different. Nora looked up at the enormous head lowering out of the mist, easily larger than the house she had wandered from, and she did not scream. She did not run. She simply tilted her head to one side, the way small children do when they see something new and interesting, and reached one small hand toward the closest scale, as if it were nothing stranger than the fence post she liked to touch back home. The great creature's breath caught, a low sound that rumbled through the stone beneath her feet. For one long moment, nothing in the mist moved at all, as if the whole mountain itself were holding still to see what would happen next. Then, slowly, deliberately, the ancient head lowered further, past the point where any predator would ever bring itself so close to prey, past the point where pride or instinct should have stopped it, until the massive skull rested gently against the stone just inches from where Nora stood. It was not a strike. It was not a threat. It was, unmistakably, a bow, the kind offered by something powerful to something it recognized as far greater than its size or age would suggest. Nora, delighted rather than afraid, patted the great scaled snout with both small hands, giggling at the warmth radiating from it, at the low vibration that hummed beneath her palms like a giant, slow heartbeat. She had no way of understanding what she was witnessing. She only knew that the huge gray creature felt warm and safe, the way her father's hands felt when he lifted her onto his shoulders, and that instinct alone was enough to keep her calm in a place where every grown being on the planet would have been frozen with terror. Threxus remained still, its head bowed, its ancient eyes fixed on the small human hands moving gently over its scales. Something long dormant stirred within it, some fragment of memory or instinct buried so deep that even the creature itself could not have named it if it tried. It was not fear. It was not submission in the way any watching alien would understand the word. It was recognition, older than language, older than the mountain itself, responding to something in this small human child that reached back through time to a promise made long before the first alien ship had ever crossed this region of space. The storm above the peak began to quiet, as though the sky itself had noticed the stillness below and chosen to settle with it. Mist drew back slightly from the ledge, revealing more of the great creature's shape to anyone who might, by some miracle, arrive in time to see it. Its wings, folded along a spine wider than any building in Rivergate, its claws, each longer than a grown man was tall, all of it utterly still, utterly focused on the small figure standing unafraid beneath its lowered head. Far below, the search parties pressed upward through the thinning storm, following the last signs of small footprints toward a ledge that no human, and very few aliens, had ever approached and lived to describe. None of them yet knew what they were about to find. None of them could have imagined it. But as the mist parted further along the upper slope, the first shapes at the front of the search line, Daniel among them, caught their first glimpse of gray stone, ancient scale, and a small, familiar figure standing calm and untouched at the center of it all. Daniel's legs gave out before his mind could catch up with what his eyes were seeing. He dropped to his knees on the wet stone, one hand braced against the ground, staring up at a shape so large it seemed to blur the line between mountain and living creature. For one terrible second, his body understood only the size of the thing bowed over his daughter, and every instinct screamed at him to run forward, to grab her, to do something. But his legs would not move, frozen by a fear too large for thought. Beside him, Kate made a sound that was half sob and half gasp, both hands pressed to her mouth. She saw her daughter's small hands resting against a scale wider than a car door, saw the massive head lowered so close that a single twitch could crush the child beneath it. And yet Nora was laughing, patting the creature's snout the way she patted the family dog back home, utterly without fear. The rest of the search line arrived seconds later, human and alien workers alike stumbling to a halt at the edge of the ledge, boots skidding on wet stone. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. The only sound was the wind sighing softly around the peak and the low, steady rumble coming from deep within the great creature's chest, a sound none of the older alien workers had ever heard described in any of the 1,000 stories told about this mountain. Grant reached the ledge moments after the others, breathing hard from the climb, and stopped dead the instant his eyes found the scene above him. He had read every file, every old report the regional council had ever released about this world, and not one of them had prepared him for what he was looking at now. Not one of them had ever mentioned a possibility like this. Voss arrived last, flanked by his 3 assistants, and it was his reaction that would be spoken about across a dozen star systems within the week. The ambassador, who had walked through 100 colonies with an expression of carved, unshakable calm, stood frozen at the edge of the ledge, his pale robes soaked through, his mouth slightly open, his eyes fixed on the impossible sight before him with an intensity none of his own people had ever seen from him. To Voss, and to every alien standing on that ledge, what they were witnessing was not simply strange. It was something closer to sacrilege turned inside out. In every account, every legend, every scrap of ancient record passed down through 100 different species, Threxus had never once lowered itself before any living being. Entire empires had sent their greatest warriors, their most honored diplomats, their most powerful weapons up this mountain over the centuries, and every one of them had either turned back in terror or never returned at all. The creature answered nothing. It bowed to nothing. It was, in the oldest text still remembered by the Ithari people, described using a word that had no true translation, but meant something close to absolute, unmoved, and eternal. And now it knelt, head lowered, before a human child too young to speak in full sentences. One of Voss's assistants dropped to one knee without seeming to decide to do it, an old instinctive gesture from a culture that still, in quiet private moments, treated the old stories about this mountain as something close to sacred. Another assistant simply stared, his scanning device hanging forgotten at his side, its readings blinking wildly with numbers that made no sense against anything in its records. Threxus, for its part, seemed entirely unaware of the audience gathering below its lowered head, or perhaps entirely uninterested. Its focus remained fixed on the small human patting its snout, its ancient eyes half closed in something that looked, impossibly, like contentment. The low rumble in its chest deepened slightly, a sound that vibrated through the stone beneath everyone's feet, through the mist, through the very air of the mountain itself. Daniel finally found the strength to move, rising slowly to his feet, every muscle in his body screaming at him to be careful, to make no sudden movement that might break whatever fragile, impossible piece was holding this scene together. He took one slow step forward, then another, his eyes never leaving his daughter. "Nora," he called softly, his voice trembling despite his best effort to sound calm. "Sweetheart, come here." Nora turned at the sound of her father's voice, her small face breaking into a delighted grin at seeing him. She patted the great scaled snout one more time, said something in the half-formed words of a 2-year-old that nobody but her parents could fully understand, and then, without a trace of fear, turned and toddled toward Daniel across the stone ledge, leaving the enormous head of the most feared creature in the region still bowed low behind her. Threxus did not move to stop her. It did not raise its head until she had crossed most of the distance between them, and even then, it rose slowly, carefully, its massive eyes tracking the small human's progress across the ledge with something that looked, to every stunned witness watching, remarkably like the concern of a parent watching a child cross a busy street. Daniel scooped Nora into his arms the instant she was close enough, holding her so tightly she squirmed in protest, his whole body shaking with relief and disbelief in equal measure. Behind him, on the ledge, nobody moved, nobody spoke, as the great creature slowly rose to its full, staggering height and looked down at the small crowd of humans and aliens now gathered at the edge of its territory, its ancient gaze settling, for just a moment, on each of them in turn, before finally returning to the small child now held safe in her father's arms. News of what happened on the mountain spread faster than any ship could carry it, moving instead through the instant communication channels that linked every world in the regional council together. By the time Daniel carried Nora back down to Rivergate, wrapped in his jacket and already half asleep against his shoulder, 3 different alien governments had already requested formal reports, and one had sent a message directly to Voss demanding to know if the footage from his own recording devices was genuine. It was genuine. Every scanner and camera carried by the delegation had captured the moment clearly, and within a day the images were being studied by historians and scholars across a dozen different species, none of whom had any explanation that satisfied them. Voss himself spent that first night not sleeping, sitting instead in the small guest quarters Rivergate had prepared for his delegation, surrounded by old texts pulled from his ship's archive. He had access to records older than most civilizations in this part of the galaxy, records passed down and copied and translated so many times that their original language had been lost centuries ago. Somewhere in those records, he was certain, there had to be some mention of anything even close to what he had witnessed. He found it just before dawn, buried in a fragment of text so old that only a handful of scholars in Ithari history had ever bothered to translate it fully. The fragment spoke of a time long before any current government existed, a time when the mountain world had first been visited by beings who were not conquerors, not scientists, not soldiers, but something the old text called simply the First Walkers. According to the fragment, the First Walkers had approached the mountain not with weapons or fear, but with open hands, and something in that approach had been remembered by whatever ancient intelligence slept within the stone, remembered so deeply that it had waited, patient and silent, through every following age, for that same quality to appear again. The fragment did not name the First Walker species. It did not need to. Voss stared at the faded characters for a long time before allowing himself to consider what every instinct in him wanted to reject. That the first beings to ever earn even a flicker of recognition from Threxus might have been something ancestral to the very species his own council had spent the last 3 weeks trying to dismiss as too young, too reckless, too new to deserve this world. He brought the fragment to Grant the next morning, along with 3 of his most senior assistants, and together they sat with Daniel and Kate in the small kitchen of their home, while Nora slept peacefully in the next room, entirely unaware of the storm of attention now gathering around her. "It is not proof," Voss admitted, sliding the translated fragment across the table. "Old records like this rarely are. But it is the only explanation that exists anywhere in our history for what we all saw yesterday." Kate read the translation twice, her hands trembling slightly. "You're saying Threxus recognized something in her? Something passed down?" "I am saying," Voss replied carefully, "that whatever bond was formed on that mountain was not random, and it was not new. It was old. Older, perhaps, than anything currently written in any of our histories." Grant leaned back in his chair, rubbing a hand over his tired face. He had spent the entire night fielding messages from council representatives across the region, some demanding immediate answers, others demanding immediate access to the colony, all of them suddenly, intensely interested in a small settlement they had dismissed as insignificant only days before. "So what happens now?" Grant asked. "To us. To the colony." Voss was quiet for a long moment, choosing his words with obvious care. "I do not know what Threxus intends. No living being does. But I know this. In 3,000 years of recorded history, no government, no army, no diplomat has ever received so much as a glance of recognition from that creature. Whatever your daughter did, whether by nature or memory or simple chance, it has changed how every species in this region will view your people from this point forward." Daniel, who had said little through the entire conversation, finally spoke, his voice quiet but firm. "She didn't do anything. She's 2. She just wasn't afraid." Voss looked at him for a long moment, something unreadable passing behind his pale eyes. "Perhaps," he said slowly, "that is exactly the point the old records were trying to make." Outside, the mist around the mountain's peak had cleared for the first time since anyone in Rivergate could remember, revealing the full shape of the great creature resting once more upon its ledge, still and silent, its ancient eyes turned, not toward the colony, and not toward the sky, but steadily, patiently, down toward the small cluster of houses where a 2-year-old girl slept soundly, entirely unaware that she had just changed the fate of an entire world. 3 years changed Rivergate more than anyone could have predicted on the gray morning the delegation first landed. The colony that had once fought for permission to exist on the edge of a restricted world now sat at the center of a slow, careful renegotiation between humanity and every government in the region, a process that moved not through threats or weapons, but through quiet meetings, translated fragments of old text, and the simple, undeniable fact that something on that mountain had chosen to notice a single human child. Voss remained on the planet far longer than any ambassador typically stayed on assignment. What began as a formal inspection turned, slowly and without either side quite planning it, into something closer to a long-term partnership. He learned to sit through Grant's blunt, direct manner of speaking without flinching. He learned to accept Kate's endless questions about the bending plants with something that almost resembled patience. And more than once, on quiet evenings, he found himself walking the edge of the colony's fields, looking up at the mountain, thinking about the fragment of old text that had upended everything he once believed certain about his own history and humanity's place within it. The council back home had not been easy to convince. Old habits of dismissing humanity as reckless and new did not vanish overnight simply because of one extraordinary afternoon on a mountain. But footage did not lie, and neither did the old records once scholars across a dozen worlds began digging deeper into their own dusty archives, finding scattered fragments that echoed what Voss had found, stories of ancient walkers who approached difficult, dangerous things without fear, and were, in turn, met with something like respect from forces far older than any government. Threxus itself remained largely a mystery. It rarely moved from its mountain, and it showed no interest at all in politics, in council meetings, or in the slow diplomatic dance unfolding in the valley below its peak. But it allowed something now that it had allowed no one before: presence. Researchers, carefully and respectfully, were permitted to study the lower slopes. Small offerings of curiosity, flowers from Kate's fields, simple drawings from colony children, were left near the old stone markers and were never disturbed, though no one ever saw the great creature except them directly. And Nora, now 5 years old, walked the base of that mountain more freely than any child, human or alien, had ever been permitted to walk anywhere near it. She did not remember much of that first day, only fragments: warmth, a low rumbling sound, the feeling of something enormous and gentle beneath her small hands. But she had grown up with the mountain as a constant, quiet presence at the edge of her life, and she showed it no more fear than she showed the old dog that slept on her family's porch. On the afternoon this story finds its end, Nora sat cross-legged on the grass near the base of the slope, sketching the shape of the mountain with a stubby-colored pencil, her tongue poking out slightly in concentration the way it always did when she focused hard on something. Daniel sat nearby, watching her with the same quiet vigilance he always carried now, though the fear that once gripped him on that stormy afternoon had long since softened into something closer to wonder. Kate knelt a short distance away, gathering samples from a cluster of plants that, for reasons no scientist had yet explained, only grew within sight of the mountain's peak. Above them, barely visible through the thin drifting mist, a shape shifted along the high ridge, patient and ancient, its great head turning slowly to look down toward the small figure sitting in the grass below. It did not descend. It did not need to. It simply watched, as it had watched for longer than any living creature on this world could measure, content in a way it had not been for centuries before that stormy afternoon 3 years ago. Voss, walking the colony's edge on his evening rounds, paused beside Grant near the old boundary markers, both men following the same line of sight up toward the distant ridge. "They still ask me back home," Voss said quietly, "what it is that Threxus sees in her, in your people." Grant shrugged, watching Nora add another careful line to her drawing. "Maybe it's not about seeing anything special. Maybe it's just that she never learned to be afraid of things she doesn't understand yet." Voss considered this for a long moment, his pale eyes drifting once more toward the mountain, toward the ancient shape resting silently along its ridge, watching over a small girl who had, without ever meaning to, changed the way an entire region of the galaxy understood both her people and the old, patient guardian that called this world home. "Perhaps," Voss finally said, something almost like a smile touching the corner of his mouth, "that is the most dangerous kind of strength there is." The mist drifted lower over the peak as evening settled across the valley, and high above the small colony that had once been dismissed as too young, too fragile, too reckless to survive on a world like this, the ancient dragon of Rivergate